So I know Phil promised that his talk would be the least technical talk of the day. I think I'm going to give him a run for his money. I figured that given the timing of this talk, since it's right between 3 hours of sort of deep conversation and lunch, I would keep this as sort of, I don't know if light is the right word, but as non-technical as possible. So today I want to talk about ethics and how they affect what we do as data scientists. And in particular, I want to propose that all of us, when we go back to the work that we do, seriously sort of consider whether putting together some sort of ethics code or ethics policy to be used within our organization might make our work better, easier to do, and sort of more ethical. When I talk about an ethics policy, what I mean is basically something that's written up, something that is, oh, sorry, is slides. Oh, cool. I actually only have one slide which just says the title, so don't worry about it. So when I talk about an ethics policy, what I mean is yeah, something that is written up, that's shareable internally and probably or potentially externally, and something that provides some set of guidelines that you might walk through when you're thinking about collecting a new piece of data or launching a new system. So I think think about something kind of halfway in between, maybe a terms of service that lists out this is exactly what we do and what we don't do, and maybe something like a style guide telling you, okay, well when you're making some new thing, you should follow these sorts of conventions. So in this talk, I'm going to kind of go through, first of all, why I think this is a good idea and why I think it might make our work better. What sorts of things you might think about if you go back and try to work on your own sort of ethics policy, and then how you might actually kind of roll this out organizationally, or what you might want to think about while you're doing it. OK, so first of all, why? Why is this a relevant conversation for us? So in almost every conversation I have with colleagues in the data science world, somehow ethics come up. The best reason I can think of as to why is, in the data science world, we've sort of been entrusted with this strange power for very strange reasons. So, we're generally sciencey types, mostly academics, who then somehow work at a startup that's successful and all of a sudden are responsible for decisions about the privacy or the sort of behavior of millions or tens of millions of users. So decisions about which pieces of data we collect or how we secure them affect, what data is potentially exposed and what data is known about tens of millions of people. The decisions about what our recommendations algorithms do or what ranking algorithms do might affect what content people in society read, and that might have interesting social effects as well. So I think a number of people are kind of bothered by this or sort of think to themselves, I should really have a policy around this. But in general, these decisions seem to be made ad hoc. So every time we're kind of trying to decide if we want to store a new piece of data or design a new database or make a new algorithm, we sort of decide kind of one by one whether it's a good idea. But we don't tend to have a real system for doing it. So that's one. I think it would sort of improve consistency and kind of take some cognitive load off of any individual decision. Second, I think it would provide some sort of benefit to the public. So if you're able to release a sort of ethics policy publicly, it at least provides some sort of check where people might read it, reporters might be able to read it, and people might understand what you're doing and what's sort of in bounds and what's out of bounds. And finally, I think having written codes makes internal conversations about ethical issues much, much easier to have. So if you're sort of thinking as a business about storing some piece of data or implementing some algorithm, and you're not quite sure that it's a good idea, being able to point and say, well, actually, we wrote down this rule that said we don't track people between sites, or we don't collect personally identifiable information, or we don't regress on parameters that are sort of protected, that are related to protected classes or anything like that. If those rules are written down, it becomes much easier to have that conversation organizationally. OK, so that's kind of the why I think it might be valuable to do it. What would it actually mean to write an ethics code? Well, first of all, I think my vision of what what ethical issues we face are very colored by my work at Chartbeat. So I'll list some stuff out, but I'm sure that for others, you'll find a different set of questions, or some of these things won't particularly apply. When I think about ethics, I think about kind of 4 issues. The first is privacy. Privacy is sort of the most obvious thing, the thing that's on a lot of our minds. And so I think privacy itself is kind of made up of a bunch of areas. Things like what data do I collect? Do I collect PII? Do I track users between pages? Do I collect information about demographics that might be sensitive? Anything like that. Then there are issues of storage. So how do I encrypt things? Who has access to databases? Things like that. And then there are issues of kind of access and algorithms that are allowed to be applied. So, for example, if I have a database that has personal information, am I allowed to query individual rows from that database and look at some particular user's data, or am I only allowed to run aggregate queries to get statistics of the data set rather than statistics of individuals? So that kind of covers, maybe some set of questions that we might want to ask ourselves about privacy. I think the next area is issues of kind of data validity. So one thing that I think comes up a lot for us in our work is when you present data to the public, it generally is sort of accepted as true. So if I put out a study that says X, Y, and Z, is true, and there are some numbers in it, reporters will take it. Members of the public will take it as kind of fact. And whereas code and data that we're using in sort of production systems is often very carefully vetted and code reviewed, what I find from talking to folks is that code and data that's used for kind of ad hoc analyses is subject to a much lower standard of rigor in general, and that somehow doesn't quite sit right. So I think questions that you might ask yourself about validity are, first of all, what's my process for vetting data that I'm going to use in a study? Do I have a sort of checklist that I walk through whenever I'm confronting a new data set that lets me see whether the data set is sort of valid or not? What's my process for vetting code? So if I am writing code to do analysis, am I required to, let's say, do peer review? Am I required to post it online so that it's accessible to any reader? There's not necessarily a right answer for every data set, but I think writing down some sort of standard for your organization may be possible. And then finally, I think in the validity topic, there's this question of how you sort of deal with and represent uncertainty in your measurements. So often if we say something like, a fact that Chartbeat might put out is, 30% of traffic these days comes on mobile devices versus desktops. With that statistic, well, there are lots of qualifiers to that. We only measure some set of sites. We only, we have a bias in geographic area, and so on and so on. And how do we disclose? What are our standards for disclosure around kind of uncertainty or bias or kind of other unknowns in our data? So after validity, my litany of things that we might think about is kind of algorithmic responsibility. This is another topic that I think there's a ton of really rich academic research on, at least. And this is this notion of kind of what are the social side effects of my work. So if I write a recommendation algorithm, how am I sure that my algorithm is not, let's say, biased in terms of maybe it promotes articles that are written by one gender versus another, or it sends job postings to people of a certain background, or something like that. And I think this algorithmic responsibility question is so particular to your organization and what you do that I don't know that I have particularly guidelines other than to read a lot of examples of where sort of algorithmic choices have gone wrong and how they can go wrong, and sort of think to yourself very seriously about steps that you might take to try to prevent that happening in your own work. And the sort of final kind of area of ethics is ethics around kind of experimentation. Many of us in our work run some sorts of human subjects experiments. So Sometimes that means running an A/B test on a website and deciding if this button should be green or blue. And sometimes it means actual sort of psychology experiments where you're recruiting subjects and actually putting them through some sort of experiment. If we were doing this research inside of academia, we'd be subject to things like IRBs. And in our world, we're really not, because all of this research sort of falls under some protected class of corporate research, right? But I do think actually asking yourself about the ethics of these experiments is really important. And questions you might ask here are, first of all, who's the consumer of this experiment? So for instance, we might decide that an A/B test, where the real sort of, although you might look at the results, the real sort of value of the results is that it optimizes a website. So it's sort of consumed by a computer. That sort of experiment we might feel is very different than an experiment where we're actually sort of working as scientists, looking at human behavior and maybe writing it up or using it to just inform our thinking. Those things feel quite different. I think also thinking about issues of disclosure, right? So do users know that they're potentially part of experiments? Do users know that they're part of this experiment? And how might we disclose in a meaningful way? And what are the sort of standards that we take for when something needs to be disclosed and when it doesn't? So OK, just to recap all of that, I laid out kind of 4 sort of broad areas of kind of ethical responsibility. Those were privacy, validity, algorithmic responsibility, and kind of experimental design. And like I said before running down them, I'm sure that there are others that sort of apply in your domain. But I feel like that's a fairly exhaustive list, at least for the work that we do. OK, so let's say that you are sort of inspired by this talk, and you go back and you say to yourself, OK, I actually want to try to do this. I want to try to write this down. What does that actually mean? What should you do from here? My first suggestion is that you read a lot. There's a lot of really good literature on this. I am a sort of passionately interested amateur, but by no means an expert, and there are experts out there. You should read examples of where these things have gone wrong. You should read examples of what ethics codes look like, things like the ACM sort of standard of ethics, things like the actuarial standard of ethics, things like journalistic standards of ethics. And then you should read some of the academic literature, especially around the algorithmic responsibility portion. My best suggestion, if you're interested, for a resource to go to, there's a great organization that's a collaboration between some industry data scientists, some folks from Microsoft Research, and the National Science Foundation, called the Council for Big Data Ethics and Society. And they have some fantastic write-ups, some really nice synopses that then sort of link out to a bunch of other work. So I can't recommend sort of reading over their work highly enough. Second of all, what we've found really useful at Chirpy is having a series of internal conversations. So we've had meetings just amongst the data science team, sort of thinking about what issues we have and what sort of problems we're confronting. And then we kind of opened that up to the company at large and sort of invited everybody in. And to my sort of surprise and delight, I think over 50% of the company came when we said, OK, we're going to do a roundtable and have a 2-hour discussion on ethics. And people came, and people had pretty passionate opinions about what mattered. And I think actually we learned a lot about what was different between what data scientists were concerned about and what even the members of our own company who weren't doing data science were concerned about. So I'd encourage you to have these conversations as broadly as you can. And then the final thing is write the stuff up. These things are not sort of legally binding, right? The goal is to write down a policy and figure out what works for you. So I'd encourage you to write it up. Share it online if you can. Put it on GitHub. At least there are a number of sort of journalistic organizations that seem to put their kind of their policies on GitHub so people can comment on them. And send it around and yeah, good luck with them. It looks like I'm almost out of time, so I want to make sure that there's time for questions, comments, people to say that this is crazy or useless or doesn't apply. So yeah, please, any questions? Someone must have. Let's see. Oh, back there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sure we're in a room full of very ethical people, but as far as I can tell, what matters for actually changing outcomes isn't ethics per se, but the institutions that enforce them. To give an example, the ethics underlying IRBs in academia are supposedly derived from the Belmont report, which explicitly doesn't apply to social science research, although those standards are in fact applied to social science research. And they are applied in such a way that there are very clear edges to what is covered by IRBs, and people can go beyond those and get around them. And what actually constrains their behavior is the institution that's there. So my question is, do you think that companies are going to enforce these policies on themselves, absent these institutional structures? And do you think they're going to come to develop ethical policies that are in any sense standardized or comprehensible, more so than the existing end user license agreements that no one reads?
It's a great question. I may be somewhat more of an optimist than I should be, but I actually think that the binding nature of something like IRBs or something like the laws that folks in finance or healthcare might have to deal with they're very important and they're very effective, but I don't think they're critical. So I think journalism is a great example, right? Journalists are people who, surely could make up stories if they wanted to, but there's a very, very strong social and personal incentive to sort of to do things in the right way. And I actually think that we all are folks who want to answer questions in ethical ways and to follow ethical policies. And having things written down where you can just point to them and say, okay, well, I'm trying to decide if I should do, X. Let me just sort of walk through this checklist and think to myself what questions I should ask myself is incredibly valuable. I mean, think about something like, an example that I think about as kind of a related thing is checklists that we use when we're releasing production code. Right? So we have things that, okay, if you're going to launch a new service, you should just walk through this checklist. Do we require that a person certify that they've done it? No. Do we, yell at or fire somebody for not doing it? Definitely not. But there's an understanding that you as a person want to do a good job in writing your code, so you walk through the checklist, and it makes your work better, it provides value to you, and it sort of makes the system better. So that's my optimistic hope for these things. Any other questions?
Okay.
Great. Well, I'll be around after if folks have thoughts. Feel free to email me. My email is josh@chartbeat if you have questions or want to discuss more. I'd love to talk about it. So thanks for listening.